Bonjour. On behalf of the Canadian Historical Association, I want to welcome you to our centenary conference, which offers us an opportunity to step back and reflect on our discipline, the historian's craft, recent historiographical debates, pedagogy, and the public place of the historian in an increasingly polarized world. I want to thank the program committee, as well as, and especially Michelle Duquette for all the work they've done that's made this conference possible. I'd like to start with my own land acknowledgement. J'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que je suis situé en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Je reconnais la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles je suis aujourd'hui. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations entre les peuples autochtones et les autres personnes au Canada. Our conference begins with a plenary session, we're starting here, dedicated to the preliminary report of the CHA Task Force on the Future of the History PhD at Canadian universities. This initiative originates in our wider concern about growing precarity within the history profession. And we've had another committee working very hard on precarity issues and thinking through how we can work with departments to try to improve things in a substantive way. 7 fantastic historians under the leadership of Catherine Carstairs have been working tirelessly on this important issue, the issue of our PhD programs since last summer. And I think their mandate was a particularly large one. On s'inquiète de plus en plus du présent et de l'avenir de doctorat en histoire dans les universités canadiennes. Des questions ont été soulevées concernant le financement et la rétention dans ces programmes et les perspectives d'emploi de nos diplômés. Dans quel but formons-nous les étudiants de doctorat en histoire? Are there ways that we can better prepare our students for careers inside and outside the academy? What of the persistent whiteness of our PhD programs? How might graduate training be decolonized? Et finalement, que peut-on faire pour revaloriser nos programmes de doctorat? And here I'm thinking of the strong tendency in many history departments to hire those trained in the US, the UK, and France. I now invite Catherine Carstairs and the 6 other fabulous members of the CHA Task Force to take it from here. Again, thank you all for being here today, and I really look forward to the next 3 days of conversation. And I'm really pleased with the program and how much depth there is in many ways. Also some weaknesses. And une des grandes faiblesses, par exemple, c'est le nombre de sessions en français. Donc, c'est un défi qu'on a comme une association. Catherine.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces here, especially people that we've connected with over the course of our research this past year. So today we're going to talk about the research that we've done to date and some of the ideas that we're working with in terms of our final report. But we have tried to keep our presentation short to leave the majority of time for your questions and comments. And we really hope it'll be a lively feedback session. So I'm going to start by introducing you to the members of the committee. I think you all have your cameras on, so maybe you can just wave to recognize to say hi. So Sam Hossack is a graduate student in the Tri-University program at the University of Waterloo. Will Langford teaches at Dalhousie University. John Walsh is from Carleton. Tina Liu hails from UBC. Martin Pâquet de l'Université de Laval. And Christine Obama-Swan, who's not here unfortunately today, is from Victoria. Je tiens également à dire un immense merci à Stephen High et Michelle Duquette qui ont fourni des tonnes de soutien dans les coulisses. Donc, merci Stephen et Michelle. Before we get into the presentation itself, we also have a request. Tina Liu took the lead on putting together a survey for the attendees, which we will also be circulating to the broader membership once the CHA is over. But if you'd like to fill it out now, we'll put the link in the chat, and we'd very much like to get your feedback to that. So we started our research by surveying the existing literature. This is really extensive, actually, and we will include links to it in our final report. The piece that struck me the most, though, was a 250-page report by the Council of Canadian Academies on degrees of success that just came out this year in 2021. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this report is, I've thought about this problem a lot from the perspective of our own discipline, history, and sort of been aware that it's a kind of larger problem in the humanities. But one of the things that this report makes really clear is this is a problem across the university system, with maybe the possible exception of business degrees. Across all of the university sector, there's a growing number of PhDs graduating. Well, again, across the sector, the number of assistant professorships is declining. And as I mentioned before, this is particularly pronounced, interestingly, not just in the humanities, but also in the sciences as well. And I think actually this holds some possibilities for us as we lobby and think about change, because if we can, build alliances across disciplines, it may help us with certain of the things we're talking about today, especially maybe funding. Some of you may have seen that a number of scientists have really recently launched a campaign to increase NSERC funding. And I'd certainly like to see something similar happen for SSHRC funding as well. The report also draws attention to the very high rates of anxiety and depression amongst PhD students, which is something we also, I think, really need to take into account. And they also point to the fact that the private sector recognizes the knowledge of PhD students, but has significant concerns about them not being adaptable. They feel that they lack teamwork and communication skills. So I think this is something for us to think about, both in terms of embedding those skills in our program, but also to the degree that they're already there, ensuring that PhD graduates can talk in the language that private sector understands about the skills that they already have. And I'm just going to draw attention here to one of the graphs in this very lengthy report, and it talks about labor market outcomes for PhDs in various disciplines. And so you can see here that humanities and the sciences are at the very bottom. There's a slight lift for people in the social sciences and education, health, and then here are the business people, which are in a totally different realm. But I think one of the things that's interesting about the humanities and the sciences is in the humanities, the report recognizes that it's been quite hard to measure the degree to which this is caused by the fact that so many people are in very precarious teaching positions, which is something we've been talking about in the CHA for a long time, and which we will also be addressing in this report. And that is really, sort of put down the salaries of people, because we know that those positions are so poorly paid, not to mention, precarious in terms of trying to find a contract here and a contract there. In the sciences, it's actually quite a similar problem, although less so with teaching, but people being stuck in postdoctoral positions, one after another, which are also quite low paid and don't provide people with any kind of job security. So I think it's just very interesting that there are similar trends happening in other places. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Will Langford, to talk about the next few slides.
All right, very good. Hello, everyone. The task force also carried out some survey work. We sent a survey to grad directors and got 11 responses. Daniel Mahan at Carleton pulled census data, and yours truly scoured various websites. There are 24 PhD programs in history in Canada involving 26 departments. We also know that historians are trained in non-history programs, but we've left that somewhat to the side. Programs vary in size, and the annual admission decisions kind of compound. So Dalhousie lets in 0 to 2 PhD students a year and has 4 people in the program. Queen's lets in 8 to 11 and has 71. Stats Canada from 2018 tells us that 56% of people pursuing PhDs in history are men, 44% are women. In the humanities, PhD graduates are by and large people in their 30s. Next. 8 grad directors gave me survey responses where I could actually use the data. And this is on people who have enrolled in history PhD programs since 2016. 11% of students have withdrawn. 80% of students are Canadians or landed immigrants. 20% are international students. And in terms of areas of study, 49% study Canadian claimed Indigenous territories, and 51% that catch-all category of the rest of the world. In broad strokes, PhD programs are similar, but once you start digging into the details, there are some pretty important differences. What I've done with this chart is shown a composite of all programs. The bars are meant to show the earliest point a student might engage in a task all the way to the latest point. The programs have between 0 and 4 seminar courses. And what I mean there is classes that you need to prepare for and go to. Programs have 2 or 3 fields, and the heaviest workload is reading the equivalent of 200 books. The lowest workload is doing a literature review and producing syllabi. Most programs have written and oral exams. There's all kinds of tinkering at the comprehensive exam level, but it's still a major hurdle. Most programs have a language exam requirement, some don't. The thesis proposal and oral defense look pretty much the same everywhere. And this big gray category, professional development, the task force has lots to say about professional development. Sam Hossack is going to say some of it, but just 5 PhD programs have professional development requirements for credit. Other programs are doing things on an ad hoc basis. Now, one of the ways program structure matters, if we go to the next slide, is racing through to that research and writing stage. So in pink, the efficient student in the efficient program, let's be honest, this is the Queen student, is making it to the research stage about a year, plus or minus a little, from a student in a typical program. Some departments are tracking graduates, some aren't, kind of very anecdotal information, but from what we've got in the data set, precarious contractually limited teaching is the largest job category for graduates at 23%. We're also seeing 17% various people finding employment in kind of university teaching and learning roles, and 12% in tenure track roles. So history PhD graduates are largely finding work in universities, but not in tenure track roles.
Part of our development of the research also involved discussions with graduate students. And we did this through both a survey that we did with the graduate student committee of the CHA, and then we also met with that committee and predominantly with PhD students who joined us there. And through both the survey and our discussions, we came up with really 2 major themes of things that graduate students are currently thinking about, have concerns about, and are looking for in their PhD programs. So the first theme is about the programs themselves. The second theme is about post-graduation and what happens after your PhD. So for that first theme on programs, funding is a perpetual concern of graduate students everywhere. For our history PhDs, that includes things like funding for domestic students and international students, especially because domestic students and international students tend to have different tuition fees and ancillary fees and other things at their universities. And so what those funding packages look like will be very different comparatively for those students. Across the board as well, questions about the number of years of funding that are provided. As we have just talked about with Will's presentation, PhD programs tend to take a lot longer than 4 years in history, but most funding is only for the first 4 years of the degree. Other concerns have to do with the cost of living in various places. Tina will remind us that the cost of living in Vancouver is very different than the cost of living in Kingston, for example. And so that's something that really does matter to students when both they're thinking about their PhD programs and where they want to go, and also when they're thinking realistically about planning out their financial lives. In addition, students mentioned that paying full tuition throughout the course of their program is something that they have concerns about. In some cases, you have a reduced tuition rate once you've passed your comprehensive exams or once you finish coursework. That's not the case at all institutions, so something that was brought up for us. And then further concerns about funding included the internal clawbacks of internal funding for students when they received any kind of external funding. And so really the funding question is about students wanting to be able to make informed financial decisions about the financial health and well-being of themselves as well as their families through the course of their PhD programs. Other concerns about programs have to do with the time to ABD or the time to completion. And a lot of this had to do with the expectations of the programs. So how many core requirements there actually are, how long it takes to actually complete those, as well as the support provided to students when they're completing each of those core requirements. Another major concern that was brought up was the discrepancies between programs. So as Will had just mentioned on our slide, I believe 3 slides ago, there are significant discrepancies between programs. And so when students are inevitably post-graduation, then competing with students from other programs for jobs, those discrepancies can really make a difference in terms of the marketable skills that they have. But it also will affect things like time to completion if you have significantly more requirements than someone at another institution who's getting the same degree as you are. Finally, a concern that was raised by our graduate students was about the value of the Canadian PhD. And I know Tina is going to talk a little bit more about this as well, but there's questions about how the Canadian PhD is viewed by institutions, both universities and other institutions, and how this affects job marketability as well. So our second theme is about post-graduation, so things that happen after our PhD students have their PhD. And so in terms of trying to prepare for those things, questions and concerns that students have to do with professional development, opportunities, and the awareness for those professional development in terms of what things there actually are out there for students or graduates of PhD programs in history to do inside academia as well as outside of academia. And really ensuring that students know when they're in their program what kinds of opportunities those are and have a greater awareness of the types of things that they might need to be able to do during their program in order to prepare for those opportunities after. As well, there was a question about the desire for promoting the value of history. And this is something that hasn't come up a lot in some of our other discussions, but for PhD students and graduate students in history, this worry about the value of history not being seen by the broader community, both the community of the academic institutions as well as the community outside of the institutions, is a real worry, particularly when you are spending upwards of 4 years working very diligently in this discipline. It's important to students that there be a promotion of the value of the history degree, and that's something that came up quite a few times in the discussions with students. Finally, the students are concerned about being prepared for the job market. Ultimately, they know that being a PhD is not, it's in and of itself a career. And so preparing for that next step and learning about what those post-graduation pathways are is something that is a great concern to graduate students. So I will pass it over to John now.
Thanks, Sam. So we met with graduate directors in 3 different settings: in the West, which is Manitoba to British Columbia, in Ontario, and Atlantic Canada. We were able to meet with McGill, but as of yet, we still haven't had a chance to sit and meet more broadly with grad directors in Quebec. Perhaps the single most important constant across these meetings has been the time to completion issue. This is perhaps a major concern for grad directors because of how it connects to virtually all the financial, logistical, ethical, and pedagogical considerations for PhD programs as they consider their own present and future directions. But since time to completion, and we've already heard some of this from Will and Sam, but it's going to be important to the entire presentation today, I'm going to instead focus on 3 other issues that, while touch on time to completion, are somewhat different, and they've been really important to us as a committee in terms of our learning and considerations we will have in mind as we write the report. The first is scale. And while it wasn't terribly surprising, it was no less revealing that scale differentiated how graduate directors explained their programs and shared their concerns for the present and future. The scale appeared in 2 different contexts. First was the size of the university where the department is located. This became especially apparent when talking about issues related to international students, as well as local resources for supporting all PhD students in terms of financial issues and professional development. Among other things, though, international students tend right now to have different prospects for tenure track appointments, and a number of universities have prioritized internationalization as part of a university growth strategy. And this kind of scale, the larger school, also appeared in discussions on how university deans and vice presidents perceive doctoral programs as foundational or not when allocating resources to departments for hires and operating budgets. The second context where scale mattered was around the size of the program itself, and Will had that broken down into those categories. And as Will's table showed, that's not always a reflection of the size of the university. For example, where there's larger cohorts of PhD students, which could be anywhere from 25 or more of current full-time PhD students, grad directors talked even more about a concern for and an investment in building a sense of community in place through departmental events, grad conferences, shared office spaces, and that sort of thing. But after 2 years of virtual learning and supervision, though, graduate directors from programs of all shapes and sizes recognize that this has been especially hard, and it is likely one of the things contributing to the growth of student disenchantment, to disengagement, and most importantly, unwellness, something that is not unique to history graduate students, as Catherine pointed out in her opening remarks. The second theme has to do with reforming the PhD. PhD programs have been engaged in reform, both before and especially during COVID. And many of these reforms have focused on 2 issues in particular: the coursework comp stage and funding, 2 things we've heard a little bit about and we're going to hear a lot more about as this presentation unfolds. One thing that became clear to us is that the COVID spark changes may or may not become permanent, and this varied pretty dramatically across the meetings. It's very much tied to local conditions and the unpredictability that continues to be part of our pandemic lives. But we did also hear much about the structural and cultural challenges to reform that grad directors face. Structural in terms of what deans and various vice presidents consider possible, but also cultural with respect to building consensus within a department for what PhD program reforms might be and should be, or if any kind of reform is even necessary at all. The third theme here has to do with the role of professors. Besides the usual supervisor-specific elements, there's clearly a wide range of opinion when it comes to defining what professors are trained to provide their PhD students, and relatedly to the resources that departments are and might be given by their universities and various provincial governments to deliver their programs, especially a program that undergoes any kind of significant reform. So this has massive impact on how learning outcomes for the PhD are defined and how they may or may not be targeted for reform at all. Even when talking about specific elements of the PhD programs and students, several of our discussions with graduate directors, and I got to experience this myself with the Ontario directors, became almost existential. Not merely how a PhD in history, but why even a PhD in history? And these kinds of questions also relate to staffing. What kinds of instructors and supervisors does a history department require to deliver on the learning outcomes, especially if these learning outcomes undergo some significant reform? And so all of this can be unsettling, discomforting. And our graduate directors who met with us were incredibly generous with sharing that they and their colleagues wonder quite rightly if the wrong kinds of reforms might work against student success, or that these reforms might redefine what a history PhD in such a way as to become disorienting for those who've already spent years, if not decades, working as professors and administrators, largely within the same program and professional parameters that they experienced as doctoral students. And so these are just three of the many things that we are learning and three of the things that we're considering. And I'll now pass this on to Tina.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you all. Good to see many of the people who participated in the 3 webinars that the CHA ran on careers in history. As many of you will know, these 3 webinars featured historians with PhDs who were working in a variety of contexts, including universities, but also the private sector, government, museums, Parks Canada, libraries, as independent contractors. I'm going to focus my comments here on those who were engaged in alternative academic careers. We can come back and talk about this more broadly in the question and answer. One of the things that stood out, I think, through these 3 webinars, which are all available on the CHA's YouTube channel. So if you haven't had a chance to watch them, I would recommend that you do. There's lots of good stuff there that I'm not going to be able to go over, lots of good detail. One of the things that struck me in just going over all of them were that all these people who were engaged in alternative academic careers called attention to the bumps in the transition, but underscored the benefits. And I wanted to underscore those today for this audience because the context in which they talked about benefits, I think led me to think about how we who are faculty approach the whole idea of alt-ac. Certainly some people who went on to pursue alternative academic careers were insistent that this shouldn't be thought of as second best, much less a failure, except that had been, in some of their cases, their experience, that they were looked on by their mentors, their committee members, their supervisors as having failed. And I think we need to think about those remarks and take them on board. So that's why I wanted to call attention to the benefits. They talked a lot. We asked them to talk about tips and tricks, and I boiled those down in terms of translation, adaptation, and experimentation. And I'll explain what each of those means in the next slide. So on translation, all of them talked about the need in pursuing an alternative academic career to translate your historian skills into language that hiring managers are going to understand. You do actually have skills. We are imparting skills. It's just that we don't think explicitly about what skills are being acquired in the process of doing a PhD. A PhD is a project, so we're all engaged in project management. We are engaged in identifying problems and gaps and the resources needed to fill them in. Sarah Shropshire, one of the people who participated in one of the webinars, talked about this explicitly, and she gave this incredible off the top of her head definition of a lit review. We all know what a lit review is within our disciplinary context, right? But if you were to translate what a lit review was to a hiring manager outside of history, outside of the academy, she says, think of a lit review as learning to assess the merits of different data sources and to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of different perspectives in order to come to a holistic synthesis or an analysis of a body of work. That is what a lit review is, and that's what it might look like if you were to think about it in terms of non-academic workplace skills. At my university, we're fortunate enough to have a PhD co-op program and a very active director of that as part in the Faculty of Arts. This is not somebody in our department. And she has pointed to a very good website, which I've got on the screen there, It's the imaginephd.com website. And that website does exactly this, help people think about their skills in a different way. It's also got some other great resources for alternative academic careers. So that's translation. Adaptation, it will be a transition to a different kind of workplace. So obviously it's good to recognize and be ready to adapt to different work cultures. A lot of them stressed it's important to know how the institution you're working for, the workplace you're working for, the business you're working for actually operates. What's the org chart if it's a larger organization? What's the process of hiring? Certainly those in the federal government that we spoke with talked about the very, very structured hiring process and the use of grids and metrics and scoring. You need to know what the hiring process is and how different it is from an academic context in order to navigate that successfully. Know what the path is from your research to the deliverables in that particular organization. All of them stress how important teamwork and collaboration was and how different that was from the solo historian working on their research in their archives and then writing their own dissertation, article, or book. And that teamwork and collaboration really has implications for how we think about our own writing and how we think about doing research. Don't get too possessive of your writing and think that you're, because that can be a barrier to the very positive and creative give and take of creating a report. Notions of credit are different. Who gets credit for what work? So there are these larger cultural shifts that are involved. Hereward Longley talked about how it was important for him, he's in consulting now, to learn to write fast, clearly, and short, and know that it'll change. Others talked about how they thought people should be prepared to take lower or perhaps entry-level jobs in the process of which they would acquire more skills and training and networks. Networks were another thing that came through as very important to getting jobs in alternative academic contexts. So that's adaptation. And then there's experimentation. Many of the people we talked to encouraged PhD students to look at the PhD and maybe even the time before the PhD as really a time to get different hard and soft skills and to establish those all important networks. And that, of course, applies to the academic job market as well. Among those skills that were mentioned were languages, and we're also including programming languages in this. Quantitative skills, this came up over and over again. Quant skills are valuable, so statistics, for instance, GIS, experience in collaborative work, and experience particularly in writing for a range of audiences and in a variety of forms. So those three things, translation, adaptation, and experimentation, were really what came through in terms of the tips and tricks our presenters came up with in the course of 3 webinars. So that's my part of the discussion of the webinars, Historians at Work, Careers in History. And now I'm pivoting to the sort of second half of our presentation. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about the first 2 years of the PhD. The first 2 years of the PhD have become the target of a lot of reforms, in part for what my colleagues have said, for reasons of funding and time to completion. First 2 years of the PhD amount in many cases to half of the years of guaranteed funding. Most universities have 4 years of guaranteed funding. Some have 5, and then in outlier cases, I think one had 6 years of guaranteed funding. But by and large, we're talking about the first, about 4, so that makes the first 2 years crucially important. So the big challenge that came through is, so how do we address the time to completion and facilitate professional development opportunities that are going to position people for alt-act careers? Those things that we've been talking about and things that came up during our webinar series. And how do we do all of this in a context where universities are doing hiring, but they're targeted hiring in our discipline for Black and Indigenous scholars? So those scholars are still seeking to be trained in what we might think of as a conventional, although that's changing, academic context. So we have a series of potentially countervailing pressures here. Want to speed up that time to completion. We want to give people exposure to, or at least exposure to, if not different sets of skills, but we also we are still engaged in recruiting and training individuals for traditional academic job market. So we might want to talk about those tensions and if they are countervailing. So the some initial thoughts that came through in our conversations with grad directors were these fundamental questions. So, you know, in the first 2 years, people are doing courses and comprehensive or qualifying exams. What are those for? What's the purpose of those? Do we even need them? Or if we do need them, in what form? What should they look like? And then what's the relationship between what happens in those first now 2 years, courses, exams, and dissertation, courses and exams, and the dissertation? So these are things that graduate programs, faculty, and students are engaged in thinking about, and I think those are good lines to think about. Can I have the next slide? There have been, as John said, reforms already taken place, and there are some ideas for change that have come through. The first is basically less is more. So fewer courses, fewer fields, comprehensive exam fields, that is, fewer books in those fields. Maybe have PhD students do less teaching initially. Often a student will come into a program and immediately be given a TA-ship, which takes up time that might otherwise be spent speeding through the coursework or getting through the comprehensive exam reading lists. So there's less is more. Substituting one of the following in that list for a comprehensive exam. So could you have a dissertation proposal take the place of one of those fields? Maybe teaching a course could do that. What about a co-op placement? Those are usually 4 or 8 months. Or how about a language or other hard skills training? So those are some ideas that many programs are already implementing, if not, or actively thinking about. There are, of course, challenges to implementing changes, and we can talk about those, but I'll just mention a few that came through in our discussions. One of the challenges is us, and when I say us, I mean faculty members. There is sometimes an inherent conservatism to overcome that people think, no, things are fine, or if we make these changes like the ones I've mentioned, what about standards? So there's the standards argument that gets raised. There's also, and this has been gestured to in the comments of my colleagues, there's limits to academic expertise. Like, what do we know? We're all ACT, we're not alt-ACT, so what do we know about training people for other kinds of careers? So there's that self-consciousness about how we can do this. If we have the skills to do this, do we have the resources to do this? And there, of course, are also structural barriers to implementing change that can emanate from university governance structures. How do you actually affect change? If you're going to change requirements for the PhD, that often involves a change in the calendar requirements, which often involves curricular change, which involves committees and voting and Senate and all that sort of stuff. So we need to think about what can departments do, who has control of what, how reform actually happens, and note that that will take time. And finally, as I just mentioned, this is a resources issue, right? It's resources in terms of our own knowledge and ability as faculty to train people, but it's also financial resources as well to implementing some of these changes. If we want, for instance, to facilitate students' ability to develop some of these alternative, these skills that I mentioned that would be useful for an alternative academic career, maybe we pay for them to take courses in project management. Those courses in the business school cost money. We pay for students to get language training that our own institutions might not offer, programming languages or other languages. So resources are a barrier. And so I throw all that out there. It's a lot. I think there's a lot to chew on, and I will look forward to our discussion in the questions. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to the next person, Will, to talk about funding.
All right, Tina's queued me up here. And so let's talk about funding. What I've shown here in this bar graph, this displays the gross annual minimum funding for domestic students. These are amounts promised on department or faculty websites or things that grad directors have told us. 4-year funding is the norm, but 5 departments are offering more than that. In blue, I've shown pay for 2 TA-ships. That's assuming 1 course per term. Hourly rates for TAs range from $17 to the equivalent of $59, but pay differences aren't the only thing. There's really big workload differences across the country. TA contracts range from a low of 60 hours to a high of 275 per term. Each department has its own complex funding cocktail, and I'm not going to get into that really. So what I've done in yellow is I've created a catch-all category: scholarships or more TA work, the remaining money on top of 2 TA-ships that's needed to meet minimum funding promises. But even this graph is not the real story. So here I've taken the very same bars that you just saw and shifted them down to account for costs. This is the net annual minimum funding for domestic students. The black line across the top is the market-based measure, a market basket measure, a Statistics Canada threshold for a livable income by location. I've chosen to include the MBM for a single person. So if anyone with dependents, you got to put that line higher. Takeaway, as you can see, in net terms, no history department in Canada promises a minimum funding package that pays domestic students a living wage. Tuition is at the bottom in green. Some universities offer tuition reductions to students who are, at a certain number of terms in their program. For comparative purposes, I've shown full blast tuition for a student who's just entering a PhD program. Those range from $3,500 annually to $9,300, unless you're a Newfoundlander in attending Memorial, and then things are better. Fees and insurance premiums for health and dental are shown in purple, and these things might be easy to overlook, but they range from just under $1,000 to as high as $2,500 a year. And so what students are paying back to universities out of their funding packages absorbs a whole lot of the minimum funding promises. And in terms of what's left, I've positioned in blue the 2 TA-ships up on top, just to emphasize that if a PhD student were to give up a TA-ship to go on research, for instance, it would take a huge chunk out of their annual income. So the question then is, how do students get above the black line, get to a livable wage? All sorts of different funding available. If individual professors are wondering what they can do, having a SSHRC Insight grant is important to be able to pay students to do research. I will just zero in on three problems that I think are raised from the information that I've just flashed at you. One is obviously the minimum wage problem. Some departments have managed to add a few $1,000s here and there to their funding packages, but it's not a livable wage. And I think that the upward pressure needs to come from somewhere. It needs to come broadly. So I think SSHRC's the issue. SSHRC's doctoral scholarships are still $20,000. And if SSHRC were to be put under pressure to raise that to say $35,000, it would completely change the funding landscape for the humanities and social sciences. And I think begin to compel universities and departments to respond. But certainly that upward pressure needs to happen. One objection to what I've shown is I've just shown you minimum funding levels, and you'll quite rightly say that not all PhD students make the same amount. But how well are departments tracking PhD student income? I don't have a good sense of that. It feels like there needs to be a bit more auditing going on. We know that there's a range of PhD student incomes, but the task force, for instance, doesn't know what the range is, doesn't know what the distribution is, at least not yet. So I think there's more work that needs to be done there too. And the third issue goes back to TA-ships making up an important part of funding packages, having to be present on campus, working courses, hinders research, which impacts kind of time to completion and getting things done. So PhD students really need to get out and do research. So I think there needs to be some sort of release funding. Some departments are trying this to get students out of TA-ships at that important moment. Once you've defended your thesis proposal, at that moment to be able to take a term off from being a teaching assistant and getting some research and having a base of stuff that you can actually work with and begin to shape the dissertation. Over to John.
Thanks, Will. So I'm going to talk about dissertations specifically, and I hope in what I'm saying is that we can take this thing that we all are familiar with at some level, but also see how some of the other themes that from Sam and Catherine and Tina and Will have brought up can also be brought to bear here, I think, on the dissertation. This I think anecdotally will not surprise anybody, but the days of the two bounded volume PhD that could run 600 to 1,000 pages, those days seem to be over completely, or very close to being over completely. One of the things that revealed itself pretty quickly is that many departments, either through recommendations or through requirements, say that PhD dissertation should run 300 pages is plenty. Much as Tina talked about, it's the less is more approach for courses and comp exams also being extended here to dissertations. The dissertation, though, is widely understood to be the capstone of the doctoral degree. And yet, overall, this is one area where reform outside of length within history departments remains less developed and even less experimental than in other areas of PhD program design. But perhaps history ought to consider a more rigorous rethinking of what a dissertation can be by creating what Tina Liu said at a recent committee meeting, and I'm shamelessly boring it, Tina, a bigger box. And there's nowhere near enough time to unpack this idea in full. So instead, I want to point to just one example of how we might embiggen the dissertation box. A number of universities currently already have in place policies that allow for PhD dissertations to adopt what's called the portfolio model, in which a student bundles together a range of published research and then writes a new introduction, might write another new chapter or contribution or a couple of them, and then perhaps a conclusion that contextualizes the already published material, and it maps the sort of intellectual and scholarly trajectory reflected in this portfolio, this bundled portfolio. Now, the portfolio model works against, of course, the traditional emphasis within history on the monograph and all of its associated values, including sole authorship, that an earlier generation, especially in English Canada, may have pointed to as unique to how scholarly historical knowledge is produced and disseminated. And yet we need to consider how much our own scholarly and academic research practices have changed over the last 10 to 20 years. SSHRC funding models and opportunities around knowledge mobilization, partnerships, and experimentation in method and practice. The rise of collaborative and co-production research. The sort of mushroom cloud development here of digital and public historical projects, across the country in a variety of ways. The most important and pressing ethical challenge facing history departments, the decolonizing of bibliographies and syllabi, and the already in progress redefinition of tenure and promotion criteria. Furthermore, alternative dissertation models, including the portfolio, might be better equipped to integrate other elements of a reformed PhD experience. For example, if a doctoral student did a co-op placement and as part of their credited coursework, and it involved research and analysis related to the dissertation topic, there could very well be a deliverable from that co-op placement that could be bundled into that dissertation and connected to the other research materials in it, right? The key thing here in thinking about the dissertation is its relationship to the degree as a whole, right? Not just as that wonderful thing that you get to do after you do the other work, but are there ways that we can think about better integrating it? Something that Tina already spoke to with regards to thinking about those first 2 years. In any respect, the dissertation is still largely one of the most conservative dimensions of history PhD programs. And yet this is in a context of great academic and cultural change. If new generations of scholars are to be made to feel not only challenged by the PhD dissertation, but also empowered to generate new ways of knowing and understanding the past, we see potential for a more ambitious reconsideration of the dissertation. This could include the portfolio model, but also a wide number of forms that define and value publishing with the same breadth and nuance as SSHRC, and now many tenure and promotion documents understand it, right? What sounds sort of ambitious or revolutionary or at least unsettling is actually, we think, more consistent with where things like SSHRC and tenure and promotion have already gone. We think such a dissertation project would not sacrifice any value as a capstone for the degree, but it would allow students on different trajectories with different passions, sensibilities, and commitment to define and execute a dissertation project that also better reflects the scholarly, academic, and cultural present in which that dissertation is being done. In a post-foundational era of knowledge-making, perhaps we should not only study historical epistemologies in the plural, but recognize, value, and amplify that producing evidence-based historical knowledge and communicating that knowledge can take a number of forms. And it's okay, if a little dangerous, for we professors to use our resources to learn with our students how all of this might work.
Okay, thanks, John. So we've talked a lot today so far about the importance of professional development for PhD programs, but I want to broaden that out a little bit and talk more about training and development generally when it comes to the PhD program. And to think a little bit about not only what PhDs themselves need to be doing, but really what skills the PhD program is delivering and what skills it should be delivering. So to begin, I actually have included grad program directors and PhD supervisors here because as Tina and Catherine and John and Will have already alluded to, some of the concerns that have been brought up is that the individuals who are responsible for training PhD students don't necessarily know what to train them in, particularly if they're not going into the academic route. And so thinking about what the roles of the graduate program directors are and PhD supervisors are, and thinking about what knowledge they already have, is one of the things that we want to think about is whether or not we should be providing opportunities for these individuals to also develop their own skills, to develop their own knowledge about what PhD students are doing after the program and what skills they need for doing those things. So on the one hand, training the people who are doing the training of the PhDs, but also doing some inventories of the skills in the PhD program and really thinking about what those skills are and maybe what those skills should be. So in Tina's conversation about the Historians at Work webinars, we heard a lot about the different kinds of skills that history PhDs have used in alt-ac or non-academic jobs. And the skills that they are using are, in many cases, skills that we do teach and do develop in PhD programs. We don't always have the correct wording or know exactly how to talk about those, but in other cases, some of those skills are missing. And those skills, such as some of the harder skills around programming languages or GIS or statistics, are things that we may want to consider providing opportunities for PhD students in history to be able to get. But some of those skills are also skills that are also necessary inside of academia that maybe some of our programs are not really addressing. So John spoke a little bit about the SSHRC requirements for teamwork and partnerships, as well as knowledge mobilization. And these are skills that are required inside of academia as well as outside of academia that aren't necessarily being directly referenced in some of our PhD programs. So thinking about how to include these types of skills, thinking about how to talk about these types of skills so that PhD students and grad program directors and PhD supervisors can all speak about those skills in a meaningful way is something that we want to consider as well. Tina has spoken a little bit as well about work experience and the importance of PhDs being able to try out different things in terms of what their post-graduation pathways are going to be. So in some cases, thinking about opportunities for co-ops or internships is always a great way to think about that work experience and helping PhD students to really get a sense of what it is like to be working in those environments, but also to ensure that they actually have some work experience on their resumes if they are applying for non-academic jobs, because that can often be a major problem for PhD students who have just spent the last 6-ish years in graduate school, potentially just finished their undergraduate before that, and so have a little bit of a work experience gap. So providing opportunities for PhDs to get that work experience while they're actually in the program is really helpful. And some of that work experience can also be helpful for the academic landscape. Teaching, for example, is a beast of itself. I'm teaching my first course right now, and it's not necessarily something that I feel incredibly prepared for. And so providing that work experience during my PhD is really helpful for me, regardless of what I end up doing when I do eventually graduate. So the work experience is also really important. Finally, thinking about what it is that a history PhD actually provides and what kind of opportunities there are for those PhD students, and continuing to develop that awareness and that networking is something that we all need to be thinking about when we are thinking about the future of history PhD programs. Of course, there's lots of issues with all of these things. Some programs already have professional development and training built into them. Some programs and some universities have some of these opportunities already developed for PhD students. Not all of them do. And so the big issues, of course, are resources. Again, so funding to be able to provide training and development for grad program directors, PhD supervisors, to be able to have the time for both supervisors, directors, students to actually do this work, as well as the knowledge is another key consideration. So thinking about some of the additional supports that might be needed, whether it's external supports, other places inside of the university or outside of the university, working with other campus resources, working with previous graduates, or those who are already in industry who can help to build some of those pathways, and even thinking about what the role of something like the CHA could be in helping to provide some of that knowledge as well. All right, so I'm going to pass it on to Catherine to close us off.
Great, thank you, Sam. So, one of the things that we've been conscious of throughout this work is the need to diversify the profession and to decolonize our approach and methodologies. And part of this, of course, comes down to our hiring practices. But of course, we also need to train and support diverse students at all levels of the history program. So, one of the things we're seeing right now is cluster hires happening on many campuses, our designated hires, which is fantastic, but we don't, of course, know if this will continue, nor is it going to solve the larger problem of diversifying the profession. It's a start, but there's obviously still much work, a lot of work to be done beyond that. And part of this, has to do with the prestige factor that came up in a lot of our conversations with both grad directors, but also in some of the webinars that we hosted too. There's a lot of advice out there telling students that they need to attend prestigious institutions. But that's also not practical necessarily for many students, especially those who have strong community ties or caregiving obligations in a certain place. And as someone who's sometimes wondered whether or not my program should continue to have a PhD program, I think having those local programs is key in terms of ensuring that a diverse range of students can get a PhD. So I do think if we're going to diversify, including having more Indigenous faculty, more faculty with disabilities, more first-generation faculty, we need to focus less, especially in hiring, on the prestige of the institution and much more on the quality of the work that has been done. One of the things that our committee has talked about is how so much of this is coming back all the time to the issue of funding. But of course, providing a better level of funding support is also key to getting a more diverse group of students in our PhD programs. Thank you so much, everyone, today for being here. And see you all shortly in another Zoom room.